Welcome to the Church Universal series, where we seek to tell the often untold story of the many apostolates in the Catholic Church which are making a positive difference in the world through their charitable works and prayerful lives. Did you know that the U.S. military chaplains serve 1.8 million Catholics worldwide? And that presently there is a tremendous need for Catholic priests to help meet their spiritual and sacramental needs? Hello, I'm Father Joseph Mary, and my guests today are from the Archdiocese for the Military Services USA. And we will be talking about the vocation within the vocation of priesthood as military chaplains. Father Aidan Logan is the Director of Vocations, and Deacon Daniel Duplantis is a co-sponsored seminarian. Welcome to both of you.
Well, it's great to be here, Father. Thank you for having us.
Now, you've been the vocation director or guide there for the military archdiocese for 6 years.
That's right.
Why don't you talk about the great need there is for Catholic priests?
Well, I'll begin with a story. I came on active duty at the tender age of 42 and found myself as a battalion chaplain with Marines, you know. It was a great challenge, I would say, but a wonderful one. But at that point, just in the Navy, we had 220 priests. And at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where I was stationed, we had 14 priests. Now, about half of us would be deployed with the Marines at any one time, but still, that was, and we were short of priests too. We didn't really have enough to make sure that every deployment had a priest. When I returned there 10 years later to be the pastor of the chapel, we were down to 7. And when the Gulf War, when the invasion of Iraq came, I was all by myself.
Wow.
They all went off.
Wow.
10 years later, I went back to be the division chaplain for 2nd Marine Division, and when I retired, there was 1 priest at Camp Lejeune. So currently, we have only 47 priests in the Navy to cover about 440,000 sailors, Marines, Coast Guardsmen.
Wow.
So
That's about 10,000 per priest,
about
I think,
that,
if I calculated
yes,
right.
just about right, yes.
Wow.
And unlike a diocese, which is, territorially compact, this is exacerbated by the fact that we're spread all over the world at any given time.
So there are needs that are really not being met right now, and I think that's one of the things we hope that this program will do is inspire young men to help meet this great need.
Yes, absolutely. And there are many young men out there who think they have to make a choice between the military, especially if they're in ROTC. They're trying to be responsible and pay for college and get the benefits of military training, and they think that they're locked into that. But in fact, even those in ROTC who have a scholarship can, through the programs that the military has, delay their service while they study for the priesthood, and then come back after they've been ordained 3 years and serve as a chaplain for a minimum of 5, which would pay back their debt.
Deacon Duplantis, why don't you talk about your own vocation, how you discerned this vocation within a vocation to the priesthood?
Yes. So for me, the call to seminary came at a very young age. I was probably at least 4 years old or even younger when I would begin playing priest, as some little boys do. I was one of those. And
in Louisiana.
So, yes.
Good, strong Catholic culture.
Very
there,
much so on both sides of my family. I was very inspired by the culture of September 12th, 2001, the day after the 9/11 attacks, because at that time there was such a blossoming of patriotism in the country, and that inspired me as a very young 7-year-old at the time. And it just so happened at the same time I had an uncle who had married into the family. He was active duty Army, and he was deployed very shortly to Iraq after the attacks. And I remember just our family worrying about him and his needs, and him coming back and saying how much spirituality did for him while he was out there deployed. And as I got older, we would follow him to several of his assignments and see the bases, and I really just was fascinated by the military lifestyle. And when I got to high school, I did 2 years of Army JROTC, so the high school program for College Reserve Officer Training Corps. And I did very well with that, enjoyed the environment. And when I entered seminary, my uncle told me, he said, you really ought to consider becoming a chaplain. He said the need is astronomical. So I took him seriously, and my whole first semester of seminary, I was doing some research. So I had contacted a chaplain from the Army, Navy, and Air Force. I contacted each one to ask, what are the numbers as far as chaplains go? What are the needs? What does a chaplain do in their particular branch, in their corps? Because each one's very different. And then sitting down with my bishop, he had a debt to the Air Force, and so when I walked in the office, he said, here you are, you have my blessing to go to the Air Force. And so I ended up there, which is great also because both of my grandfathers are airmen as well, so I'm very happy to carry on that legacy. And then as far as discerning active duty, what we have is the candidate program.
Okay.
And so what the candidate program does is when you get accepted to a graduate seminary, you commission as either a second lieutenant in the Army or the Air Force or an ensign for the Navy. And then you do training during the summers while you're still in seminary. So that includes some kind of officer indoctrination course. The Air Force is now doing an 8-week total force officer training. And then after that, you're doing some kind of chaplain training specifically. So we'll have a chaplain candidate intensive internship for the Air Force. And then we also have active duty tours. So usually about a 5-week tour for summers in between that and ordination to count for your days, but also to intern with an active duty chaplain to see what they do, what that life is like, get to work with different units and see what it is to be a chaplain. And so that feeds very well into overall discernment. Like, am I suitable to do this? Is this a good fit for me in my vocation to the priesthood?
Father Logan, I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that when we think of the military, we just kind of put a blanket, that they're all the same. And yet you're a Cistercian, I'm a Franciscan, and there's a uniqueness to each of the branches of the military.
Yes, each, to use Catholic terms, each one has a different liturgy, a different canon law, so to speak, yes.
Right.
And just the culture, the Navy and Marine Corps perhaps the closest because they work in tandem with one another. But just for historical reasons, the Army took a very different turn at the time of the Revolution, following the Prussian model. And Washington had generals from Poland and Prussia who worked with him, in forming the Continental Army, whereas the Continental Navy and Marines grew right out of the Royal Navy and Royal Marines, and they just carried that same culture along. So, and then the Air Force, of course, came from the Army in the late 40s, but they consciously developed their own culture too.
So you're helping young men discern. I guess that's part of it, to look at these cultures and maybe to see where
though
there's
I
a
must
fit.
say they've usually reached that decision before they decide whether or not they're going to enter the seminary. Usually it's got a lot to do with the family, like Dan, and though I'm kind of a renegade, everyone in my family was in the Army or the Army Air Corps, and here I was in the Navy. So,
now, what are some of your efforts to help increase vocations to the military archdiocese?
Yes, well, we have 2 discernment retreats a year, one on the East Coast, one on the West, and we'll bring men, whether they're in the military at one of the military academies or simply civilians who are interested, men in ROTC programs at different universities and colleges. So we bring them to a seminary for a long weekend to interact with one another and with the seminarians, take part in the liturgy, have conferences. We have chaplains there from all 3 branches. And we also invite local vocation directors to come to tell them what the discernment process is with the diocese. So while we co-sponsor men with their home diocese, the formation and call to orders are in the hands of the local diocese, because we have no priests or seminarians, strictly speaking, of our own. They're all on loan to us by
Right.
their diocese. So we of course will make the call on whether or not the man is fit to be a chaplain, but the call to the priesthood is within or the religious community for that matter, is up to their superiors, and because that's where they have to be rooted in their home diocese or their religious community.
Deacon, you said that was something very important in your discernment, these
Correct.
retreats. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so the retreat is it's a great opportunity to meet the chaplains, first of all. And it was also great as a resource to get to talk to guys who are currently in the military, not yet in the seminary. And then it's the same thing on the reverse, is we were also a resource for them, for the guys who were not yet in the seminary and had to make that step first. And so at least half of the retreat is geared towards priestly discernment, to discern, first of all, am I called to go to the seminary? Because that call is fundamental for the chaplaincy. And that also includes the call to celibacy in that. And then just being able to meet the chaplains, hear about what they do on a day-to-day
Sure.
basis, and then hoping to kind of get an idea of, is this a good fit? Is this something that I'd like to do? And for me especially, it felt like it was a good match. And so I contacted my bishop before I left the retreat and said, it's going very, very well. I said, I think this is something I would like to pursue. And so we did. So just a few months later, I had signed my co-sponsorship agreement. So it was very instrumental with my discernment and my decision to enter the program. So I really do highly recommend it.
You know, the Lord does send laborers into the vineyard. So what if there's a young man who's thinking about it, maybe he's feeling a little bit of a prompting that I could help meet this need. What would you suggest to him as far as approaching the military archdiocese?
First and foremost, get a spiritual director, and this is for any young man who's discerning priesthood. The spiritual director will help you, first of all, pray about it, learn how to unpack what the Lord is asking of you. Also, I like to tell guys that you don't have to pick between priesthood and military, because I know a lot of young guys I've met over the course of the last few years who've said, I really feel called to do one or the other, and I'm just not quite sure. And then when we go to conferences or youth festivals and we have a display table and we're in uniform and they see us in uniform and they hear that we're seminarians and they say, aha,
Yes.
I can do both. So really just to keep praying about it, and that prayer is so instrumental in this decision. So get a spiritual director. Do your research. You know, if you contact the recruiters for Army, Navy, Air Force, Chaplain Corps specifically, they will give you more information about those branches, and that helps to make the decision a little bit more focused. So that way you're thinking about a particular branch. It's not so big when you're looking at just military in general, because each one is very, very special in what they do. But ultimately, prayer has to be at the heart of the entire discernment process.
Now, what would be some common elements? I mean, you think about the military, you think about discipline, valor, service. A lot of that can be related to the priesthood and self-gift.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And I'm happy to say that our men we have 47 men in the program now, and another 10 in the works. So maybe by the spring we could have well into 50 men. But when I visit the seminaries, and we have them in 22 seminaries across the states and in Rome, the rectors all say, can you send us more? Because their military background prepares them very well for seminary life. And, and I think it's because fundamentally, though we wouldn't use the same vocabulary, we're still working to build a foundation of a virtuous life, whether it be with soldiers or Marines or airmen or sailors. Those same elements of a virtuous life apply in a religious and priestly vocation as they do in the military.
You know, it's interesting that soon-to-be blessed Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, that he had addressed the West Point cadets, I believe it was, and he said that when you see a culture collapsing, it's usually the soldiers that are the last to collapse. Why? Because they've been trained in discipline.
Yes.
You give yourself for the other, lay down your life for others, you make sacrifices for a greater good than yourself.
Yeah. One of our newly canonized saints recently was a military chaplain in World War I, and that was St. John the 23rd.
Oh, really?
And yes, and he wrote beautifully about his experience, mainly as a hospital chaplain dealing with the wounded and the dying. But nonetheless, he, as Patriarch of Venice and later as Pope, spoke and wrote very eloquently about it. And so, you know, it is truly a vocation within the priestly vocation. And there are many saints who were military chaplains.
Could you name some others?
Well, there's St. John of Capistrano.
Yes, a good Franciscan.
Yes. Well, most of them are Franciscans. And
right.
then the recently beatified of Aviano, what's his first name?
Aviano.
He was the chaplain on the flagship at the Battle of Lepanto.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
Right,
yeah, and
okay.
Mark of Aviano,
Oh, yes.
that was his name. There are two wonderful German priests who were chaplains in World War I and received the Iron Cross for bravery and were martyred by the Nazis. And then there's one of the most intriguing was an Italian chaplain named Father Bruno Nocchi, who was with the Italian Alpini on the Russian front, and got them through all sorts of terrible things and brought them home and spent the rest of his life taking care of
So it is a
veterans.
path to sanctity,
Absolutely.
serving others, being
Absolutely.
there.
Absolutely.
What was it that really attracted you then to become a military chaplain? You're going to be ordained, God willing, next year.
Yes,
right?
June 6th.
And then you'll go on active duty shortly after that?
Yes,
or-
3 years. It's 3 years in the diocese first, and then we go
Okay.
active duty.
Okay.
Yes.
So what were some of the elements that really drew you to become a military chaplain?
I really like the order, and that's probably part of my temperament. Is I thrive on order, and so I really like the environment of regulation. It's easy to know what's coming up. Sometimes there's always that unexpected kind of thing there, and I like the action of it. Like, you know, it seems like it's such a heroic thing to do.
Right.
To get out there, put on the uniform. There was something. I think the sense of service is really what drew me to wanting to be in the military, and I saw that from, like I said, from that culture, from stemming from September 11th, and what happened with people joining to serve the country, to go defend from what had happened. And so I think it was that sense of service and the desire to give for the country, to give for something greater than yourself.
Right.
And that really just struck a chord with me. It's kind of hard to explain sometimes, but it really did strike some internal chords. And really, it was a drawing, like you say, you know, that really drew me. It's like a magnetism to wanting to do this.
But you think, and so often our culture today is talking about emphasis on the individual, on yourself, your needs, your wants, however you want to express yourself, right?
Right.
But this is a total different way of thinking, which our Lord said the greatest love is to lay down your life for others. And so as a military chaplain, you may even physically do that, like Capodanno, right? Vincent Capodanno did in Vietnam, and others.
And no, the military is an inherently dangerous occupation. We don't have to be at war. My very first deployment, we were going to spend 6 months on a ship in the Mediterranean, Marines and sailors. And before we even got there, we lost a helicopter with 5 men on board, which is one of those accidents that happens. But you're confronted with the mysteries of life and death in a way that you're not in the civilian world.
There's an immediacy to it.
Thanks be to God. I mean, if we lived in Afghanistan, everyone is confronted with that. But we're, by God's grace and the efforts of others, we don't have to face that in our culture, generally speaking.
That has to be such a comfort in those times of tragedy that are so often experienced in the military, to have the presence of Christ there in the priest, in the sacraments, and just a listening ear.
Yes. Well, the listening ear is really important, especially because all chaplains, not just Catholics, have absolute confidentiality in their pastoral counseling and their interviews with people, as well as, of course, confessions. So everyone comes to you. The colonel talks to you. Youngest lance corporal, the seaman recruit. You're a listening post for all of them, and someone who will keep confidentiality, but will have a sympathetic ear, an empathetic ear for them, and that's an extremely important safety valve in any military unit.
Now, Deacon, we had Father Rudeman on our first episode.
Yes.
He is Air Force chaplain, and you spent the summer with him so you could have some experience of what that military chaplaincy is like.
Yes.
Why don't you talk about some of your experiences?
Yes, so it was a 5-week active duty tour, and the way that we did it, you could do it really one of two ways. Is you could either do it where you're spending time with several different units on base, or you could really kind of focus the tour to being with one unit on base. It just depends on the needs and what you've done before in your training. So this was my first, what we call a follow-on tour after the chaplain training. And so with this tour, we decided to go a little bit more general. So we split the time up. So the first 2 weeks I was assigned specifically with Father John at med groups. That's the hospital on the Air Force base. The third week I was assigned to mission support groups. That's your security forces, firefighters, people who keep up the facilities, communications, contracting, all those guys. And then the last 2 weeks I was at the training group, and the training group is the largest group at Keesler. In fact, the base wing is known as the 81st Training Wing. So a great opportunity to spend time with the trainees, many of them right out of boot camp.
Yes.
And so they're trying to unpack this whole experience.
Right.
What's it like to be in the military? So we got to kind of walk with them through that unpacking, and it was a very powerful experience to be there at the beginning of these guys' career.
Father Logan, if somebody wants to learn more, and possibly if they're drawn toward the military chaplaincy, how can they learn more?
Well, they go to our website, www.milarch.org. And they could email me at vocations@milarch.org. That's the best way to get in touch with us. I'll promise to get back with you, maybe not that day, but as quickly as I can. And probably will, maybe if you give me some information about yourself, a phone number, we can talk, and maybe come to one of our retreats, and we'll see how it goes.
So young men are contacting you?
Yes, I would say I get at least 2 or 3 inquiries a week. So the word is out there. I wish that more would come, and I'm sure that if we had more priests on active duty, more young men would be attracted to the priesthood, because that's a big factor, the contact with a priest,
Deacon, why would you encourage a young man to look into this?
It's really the best of both worlds. I think that's the best way to describe it. Priesthood itself is probably one of, if not the most difficult vocations on the planet in terms of the things that we have to walk people through. We're there at the best of times and the worst of times. Throw in the military with that, you're out there, you're seeing the world first of all, and you're ministering in a truly global environment. I think very succinctly, it's that the military chaplaincy is the way to see the universal church as universal, to get out there to minister in just about any kind of environment. So it's adventurous, it's the best of both worlds, and it truly is the call within the call.
Beautiful. Father Logan, any closing thoughts, or why you'd encourage young men?
I'd reiterate something that came up in the first segment of this, and that is, there is no priestly ministry that is more immediate or intimate, especially on deployment. Here are men, maybe even Catholics, who have never met a priest in their lives. And now they're living with one 24/7 for 6, 7, 8 months, and there's no privacy, you share everything. And it's a remarkable experience, because I've seen this time and time again. You're not aware of the influence you have perhaps till later, and then you get a Christmas card or something. Father, I'll never forget, when we were in the Persian Gulf, things like that. So you don't even know the effect you're having at the moment, but it is very profound.
That's because Christ is present in the priesthood, right?
Yes,
in a very
absolutely.
unique way.
Absolutely.
That he is present to these people, and we all need Christ and people in these situations and struggles, definitely Christ.
And you can also see the strength the sacraments bring
yes.
to men and women in those situations. It's really hearing confessions and saying Mass in those settings. I can't describe how wonderful it is.
Did you ever celebrate Mass on a Jeep?
Well, we don't have Jeeps anymore. We have Humvees, and the hood of the Humvee is slanted, but the tailgate is perfect.
Okay.
So I often said Mass on the tailgate of a Humvee.
Thank you both for being with us, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, Father.
Perhaps some of you young men are being called by the Lord to priestly ministry in the military chaplaincy. The need is great for the sacramental and spiritual support of the brave men and women who serve our nation at home and abroad. And the Lord is calling some of you to be His hands, His feet, and His heart to them. Pray about that. We will see you again this time next week for another episode of the Church Universal.